It certainly hasn't been the prettiest or most enjoyable last couple months of Orioles baseball, but we don't have to worry about all that right now because right now we are celebrating. The Orioles have finally clinched their spot in the 2024 Major League Baseball postseason. I'll tell you how they did it with a win over the Yankees and a little bit of help on Tuesday night. Coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Wednesday, September 25th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we are going to recap the Orioles' 5-3 victory over the New York Yankees on Tuesday night. I'll get you the 5 things you need to know from that one, including the home run ball, some situational hitting, a big start from Dean Kremer, and a playoff-like bullpen performance from Brandon Hyde and his relievers. And with that win and a little help from the Miami Marlins, the O's are into the postseason. We'll talk about what's next with the playoffs as well. And then a little bit about the other big roster move that we got on Wednesday. The O's got another injured guy back as Ryan Mountcastle is back with the O's. What kind of burst can he provide? That and more is all coming up on this episode, this clinching episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Booking.com. Booking.com, Booking.yeah. The right stay can make you a fan of any city, even your baseball rivals. Book today on Booking.com, the official accommodation partner of Major League Baseball. Get the Booking.com app today. So the Orioles are in the playoffs. Yes, September 24th was a little bit later than we thought they would finally clinch a postseason berth. And yes, while they are still technically alive for the AL East heading into Wednesday, it's not going to happen. They're going to be a wild card team. But you know what? A win is a win, and getting in is getting in. And I've continued to say, get in and get healthy for the last 2 months. That's all I needed the Orioles to do. And they've basically done that because everyone but Grayson Rodriguez is back, and they are now officially into the playoffs. Coming into the day, the O's had a magic number of 2. They needed a win over the Yankees and a loss by either the Twins against the Marlins or by the Royals against the Nationals. Thought it might be the Royals. Because the Nats couldn't do literally anything. The Royals won 1-0 in 10 innings at Nats Park. But the O's won the game. They went into the clubhouse. They saw the bottom of the ninth of Jesus Tinoco closing out the Twins. A 4-1 win for Miami over Minnesota, which means the Twins can't catch the O's. It means the Orioles, at the very least, are into the postseason, with them doing their work as well with a 5-3 victory over the Yankees to get to 87-70 on the year. So let's begin with the 5 things you need to know from the Orioles win over the Yankees on Tuesday, because the much more important part of getting into the postseason for the O's was actually winning their own baseball game. Yes, they needed a little bit of help, and yes, they got it, but beating the Yankees was step 1. And the first thing you need to know from that one is the long ball powered the Orioles again in this one. The O's, in their last win, which was Friday night against the Tigers, had 5 home runs in that game. For the first time all season, they had a 5-homer game. And 3 of them were solo shots on Friday. Well, they got 3 more solo home runs on Tuesday. It was Anthony Santander, the final batter that Clark Schmidt faced for the Yankees, hitting one off the McLouth pole in right field to make it a 3-1 game. The very next inning, Ramon Arias, his second game back from the injured list, little Oppo Taco, making it 4-1. And then, as the Yankees were creeping back in, an absolute bomb from Colton Cowser in the top of the 8th, 114 off the bat, 430-some feet to make it 5-3. And yeah, you would like those homers to come with some runners on base. Again, all 3 of them were solo shots, but you will take it from a team who was on an incredible pace home run-wise the first 3 months, then has really just been more of a normal home run hitting team since then. Hitting the ball out of the ballpark, plays in the postseason. Over the last 3 postseasons, that is 2021, 2022, and 23, the last three normal ones, because we know 2020 was not a normal year and not a normal postseason. In those three playoffs, there have been 72 games. Teams, well, I should say this, 72 games where someone out-homers someone else, where there's not an equal amount of home runs. In those 72 games, the team that out-homers their opponents are 62-10 over the past three postseasons. If you don't think hitting homers is important in the playoffs, look at that stat right there. 62-10 teams that out-homer their opponents in the postseason over the past 3 years. If the O's can get that home run ball rolling again, they are going to be set up well now that we know they are into October. Second thing you need to know from Tuesday's win, the O's also had some good situational hitting as well in this game. They didn't knock the cover off the ball. They scored 5 runs. It's a good night. It's not an amazing night at the plate. But they got a Westburg single, a Ryan O'Hearn double in the second. And then it's a 0-0 game, second and third, one out, top two. Yankees played the infield back, and Heston Kjerstad just does what he needed to do. Yeah, it wasn't a big fly. Yeah, it wasn't a 2-run single. But he rolls one over to second base. And you know what? With the infield back, that becomes an RBI ground out and puts the Orioles up 1-0. And the O's, I believe, are the best team in baseball this year when scoring first. So that's certainly going to help you right there. And that is what the O's did. And then in the fourth inning, after Santander got on via a walk, he went to second base on a wild pitch with 2 outs. And Ryan O'Hearn came through again, poking a ball through the left side for an RBI single to make it 2-0. You get a hit with a runner in scoring position. You get a productive out with a runner in scoring position. Ryan O'Hearn now with 2 multi-hit games in his last 4. He's starting to heat up a bit after just a really, really slow last couple of months. All good signs for this Oriole offense, who, 5 runs on 8 hits. It's not the biggest splash offensively, but they also drew 4 walks in this game and just took some better at-bats against Yankee pitching. Third thing you need to know from the O's clinching victory on Tuesday is that Dean Kremer did it again in a huge regular season game. Now, we know the biggest game that Kremer has ever pitched in was Game 3 of the ALDS last year, and Kremer got smoked by the Rangers in the game that ended the O's 2023 season. But other than that, he has started all 3 clinching games over the past 2 years for the O's. Last year, mid-September against the Rays, that wild game in which the O's clinched a playoff spot, he went 5 innings of 1-run ball. Then in the game late last September where the Orioles clinched the division against the Red Sox, Kremer went 5 1/3 scoreless in that one. And this one here on September 24th, 2024, when the O's clinch a playoff spot, 5 innings of 1-run ball from Dean Kremer on 3 hits, 3 Ks, 2 walks, and a homer on 83 pitches for the right-hander. Just 4 hard-hit balls allowed to Yankee hitters in this one. And again, you still want him to take that next step, which is showing he could do it in an actual postseason game. But the way Kremer has been pitching down the stretch here, he now has a 2.25 ERA in his 4 starts in the month of September. I have mostly been leaning towards Albert Suarez being the Orioles' number 3 playoff starter, knowing that Corbin Burns and Zach Eflin will go in games 1 and 2. And it's looking very unlikely that at least early in the postseason, the O's would have Grayson Rodriguez back as a starter, meaning it was basically down to Suarez, Povich, Kremer for that final start. I've been leading Suarez, but he's been struggling a little bit. Kramer's been pitching so well, and you can look at it this way. Yeah, it went horribly in the playoffs last year, but he got that first postseason start under his belt, and he has that to work off of. I think now if I'm picking a number 3 postseason starter, after Tuesday night, Kremer has gone back to the top of my list as the guy I would go to in Game 3 potentially of the wild card series next week. I mean, he was just painting the 4-seamer and the sinker on the corners all night long. It was impressive to see. The 1 run was an Aaron Judge home run, the bottom of the 4th. It was a 3-2 splitter, caught a little too much of the plate, but it's also Aaron Judge. He hit it into the left field seats to make it 2-1. A, you're going to give up homers to Aaron Judge, so just make sure they're solo shots. That's what the O's did. And B, if you're facing the Yankees and you give up 1 run and it's a solo shot to Judge, that's just a regular night's work against the Yankees offense. That's how incredible Aaron Judge has been this season. You're not even mad at that. You're happy it's a solo home run and you move on. And that is what Kremer did. He gave up the homer and then he moved on and he got out of a huge jam in the 5th inning to keep the O's up 2-1 and just did his job, pitched well enough, gave them a chance to win. And that is what he's done now 3 times over the past 2 years in these clinching scenarios. Fourth thing you need to know from the O's win over the Yankees on Tuesday night is that Brandon Hyde deployed his bullpen like a playoff game, and it worked in this one. After Kremer gave him 5, he basically just mixed and matched to get the final 12 outs in the final 4 innings of this game. He uses 6 relievers, and it, with 1 or 2 speed bumps, really, really worked out. I mean, it started off something that was, I was not feeling great about Keegan Aiken facing Soto, Judge, Wells in the bottom of the 6th with a 3-run lead, or 3-1 lead, I should say. And he pitched well. He did walk Judge. You're not mad at that, but he got Soto, he got Wells, he got his outs. Jacob Webb comes in, inches away from giving up the game-tying 2-run homer to Giancarlo Stanton, but he battles back, and then for the second time this season, Webb strikes out Stanton in a big spot with a sweeper that legitimately bounced halfway into the left-handed batter's box, and Stanton still swung and missed at it to end that 6th inning. That was a big out from Jacob Webb. Then they went to Cionel Perez, who had a little bit of bad luck. Colton Cowser misplayed a little bit, a ball in left field, and then an infield single from Verdugo, or Westberg just couldn't get the ball out of his glove on a play that should have ended that 7th inning, and things got a little hairy there for the Orioles. They went to Yennier Cano. He gives up an RBI double. He gives up an RBI single, but the Yankees help him out a little bit, and he gets out of the inning at 4-3. And then just Cano gets Judge to fly out to the track in the 8th. They go to Gregory Soto in really the biggest spot Gregory Soto has pitched in since joining the Orioles, and he was great. Retired 3 batters in a row. Unfortunately, walked Anthony Rizzo on a 3-2 pitch with 1 out in the 9th with a 2-run lead. You just can't be doing that. But he got his 3 outs, and I thought, wow, is Soto going to finish this game? No. It was still Seranthony Dominguez who got a chance to close it out after having kind of a rough outing last week in the game the Orioles eventually won against the Giants. And Soto got what he needed. He gets himself a ground ball and a fly out against 2 lefties. Home run ball did not hurt him. And the Orioles just mixed it together. Fantastic job by Brandon Hyde pulling the right strings. Fantastic job by pretty much all these relievers making the right pitches to get big outs against a really good, really hot Yankees lineup in a ballpark that is really tough to pitch in. These 6 relievers combined, and these are really going to be your guys. And this is such an interesting part of the Oriole bullpen right now because, yeah, Dominguez is kind of the closer. I don't know if he is the lockdown going to have every 9th. I mean, Soto and Cano and others could get some chances there. But you look at these 6 guys that got outs in this game. You didn't even use Danny Coulombe, who's going to be in this group of guys you're going to trust to get some outs in the postseason. You didn't even use really Matt Bowman, who has gotten some key outs in the middle of the game for Brandon Hyde since the O's added him to the roster. You're kind of looking at a bullpen where there's not one crazy dominant arm, but you could argue that 8 of the 9 relievers on this team, Brandon Hyde could potentially use in a high leverage spot. And while it's not the same as having untouchable Cano and Bautista in the 8th and 9th like the Orioles did last year, this is maybe a much better middle part of the pen that they have going into the postseason, where Hyde feels like he has a lot more options in key spots. That could maybe work out even better when you have to shorten games and use relievers earlier in the game in the postseason. Maybe that's a good sign for the O's. And the 5th and final thing you need to know from the Orioles' 5-3 victory over the Yankees, and with some help with the Marlins win over the Twins, clinched the O's a playoff spot here in 2024, is that, yeah, it was good pitching, and yeah, it was timely hitting, but wow, that base running gaff by the Yankees in the 7th certainly propelled the Orioles into the postseason. 2nd and 3rd, 2 outs, Orioles leading 4-2. Yennier Cano facing Juan Soto for the first time. Soto rips a 1-hopper for a base hit out to Santander in right field, who's got a great arm. The first run easily scores. Gleyber Torres is coming towards third base, and the Yankee third base coach has the stop sign on, which I think was the right call, especially because you have Aaron Judge coming up next, and you figure he'll come through to at least tie this game or more. And Torres does hold up, and the throw comes to the plate. And then for some reason, Soto tries to go to second. Rutschman throws it down to second. And then for some even weirder reason, Torres then takes off for the plate. Henderson makes an easy throw back home, and the Orioles, and I mean, coaches, show your kids, your players, your young players, the rundown that the Orioles executed between third and home to get the final out of the bottom of the seventh on Tuesday. It was perfect. The way Rutschman held onto the ball, the way Henderson replaced, the way Mountcastle replaced, the way some guys stayed, the way Henderson got from second base to third base to continue to be in the rundown, the way Cano got to home plate and Ryan Mountcastle came down to home plate to be part of the rundown. That was just chef's kiss to execute a rundown. And thank you, Gleyber Torres, and I believe Luis Rojas, who is the Yankees third base coach, for whatever that was, for allowing the Orioles to get out of that seventh inning and eventually win this game and get into the postseason. And it wasn't just getting into the playoffs. I mean, that was the big celebration, obviously, from the Orioles on Tuesday, but also they did the one side of it, the get in, the get healthy. That also continued on Tuesday because Ryan Mountcastle is now back with the O's. We'll talk about what he could bring down the stretch and what the corresponding move was for the O's. That is coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Booking.com. Booking.com, Booking.yeah. You can explore those U.S. cities you always secretly wanted to learn more about, with hotels, bed and breakfast, vacation rentals, resorts, and so much more on Booking.com. You might just find your perfect stay, even in your baseball rival city during the postseason. Now, it would seem if the O's host the wild card round, they'll probably match up with the Yankees in the ALDS if they get there, but maybe Cleveland could make a run to that number one seed. Maybe it could be O's Guardians in the ALDS if they get there. So maybe you want to check out some hotels in Cleveland, and you can do so on Booking.com. They've got hotels that look over stadiums. They've got family-friendly resorts, cute bed and breakfast. Booking.com has so many choices across the U.S., especially if you're getting ready to travel in the postseason. The right stay, well, it can make you a fan of any U.S. city, even your baseball rivals. You can get it at Booking.com. Booking.yeah. And this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's number one sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, like the Ravens might blow this lead again, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. And you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. And you can do it all at FanDuel.com. So finally, officially, the Orioles are headed to the postseason. And also, the Orioles got another contributor back on Tuesday. Ryan Mountcastle was activated from the 10-day injured list after he had been out since August 22nd with a left wrist sprain. He slid into second base in that Thursday night loss to the Astros at Camden Yards, had to leave the game. He was kind of on the bench, unavailable, maybe available for a couple of days. Then finally, the Orioles placed him on the IL 4 days later and backdated it a couple days. And the O's thought, oh, maybe we'll avoid the IL. Okay, we have to put him on. It'll probably be the minimum 10 days he'll be back. Well, Mountcastle then really did not progress like the O's wanted, and the injury seemed to be a little more severe than they initially thought. And at one point, we were like, is he done for the year with this wrist sprain? But Mountcastle got himself into some rehab games in AAA Norfolk last week, started to swing the bat well. In his first rehab AB in AAA, had his hardest hit ball exit velocity-wise in the second half. That was good to see. That tells you the wrist is feeling good. And he comes back to the O's, and well, he wasn't in the starting lineup against the right-hander. He pinch hits for Ryan O'Hearn in the sixth inning, and what does he do? He laces a single up the middle at 107 in his first at-bat. He had 2 hard hit balls in his 2 ABs. He looked good defensively at first base when he stayed in the game. Mountcastle seems to be good to go. And that is just another guy to get into this Orioles lineup. And the O's have not had Arias, Mountcastle, Westberg, all these guys together in a starting lineup since July 30th. Hat tip to Jacob Calvin-Meyer, the Baltimore Sun, for pointing that out. It's been a long time since that happened. Long time without these guys. They got Westberg and Arias back over the weekend. Now they get Mountcastle back. as well. He's having a solid year, a 107 WRC plus in 485 big league plate appearances before the injury. He's kind of become a different hitter. His power's been down, his strikeout rate's down, but also his walk rate is down. The 27% pull rate for Mountcastle is the lowest of his career. He's kind of become more of a contact hitter, which was not what we thought from Ryan when we saw him hit 30 plus home runs back in 2021. But he was really struggling in August before the injury. 74 plate appearances, hitting just 225, not walking, not hitting for power, 61 WRC plus. But he still does have a 126 WRC plus. Again, that is a stat where kind of all-encompassing, park adjusted, 100 is a league average. 126 versus lefties this year. He certainly helps you there. He'll definitely get the start against Nestor Cortez later this week, and we'll see that'll be in tonight's game. We'll see if he's in there against Garrett Cole on Thursday as well. But it just makes the Orioles lineup longer and gets their regulars, their regular producers into the lineup. And we'll see how he fares for the rest of this week. The Orioles really like Heston Kjerstad in there as well. And you just can't play all four of Santander, O'Hearn, Kjerstad, and Mountcastle at once. It just can't happen. So against righties, one of them's going to have to sit, and more than likely it's going to be either Mountcastle or Kjerstad. So that's going to be a decision they're going to have to make. Kjerstad did get the start against the righty over Mountcastle on Tuesday. So we'll see what happens. But either way, Mountcastle's playing all against lefties, and either way, he's just a big part of your offense. He's been playing some fantastic defense at first base this year. It is huge to get him back. Now, I talked about how when Mountcastle came back, the O's had two more hitters that could go, either Eloy Jimenez or Emmanuel Rivera, and they chose to option Eloy Jimenez. Now, Jimenez did have options, but he had enough MLB service time that he would have been able to refuse that option and be placed on waivers instead. However, Jimenez said it's fine to option me. Now, the reason he would do that is there are 6 games left in the regular season. No one's going to pick him up. And even if they did, he wouldn't be eligible to be on that team's postseason roster anyway. But he is still eligible to potentially be on the Orioles playoff roster, even though he was just optioned to AAA. So it's more than likely he's probably still with the team in New York. Hopefully he got to celebrate in the clubhouse on Tuesday. But unfortunately, it just in 2 months didn't work with Eloy Jimenez. He was pretty good when he first came over in August after the O's basically picked him up for nothing. They ran him out of town in Chicago at the trade deadline, but he ended up with 100 plate appearances, a 68 WRC plus with the Orioles. Walks were down, Ks were up, stats were even worse from his time with the White Sox. Now, the big thing for the O's with Jimenez was we want to get the launch angle up. This guy hits the ball incredibly hard, over a 50% hard hit rate, but he hits it on the ground way too much. A 2.7 degree average launch angle is not going to cut it. That's what it was with the White Sox. He upped it to an average 8.4 degree launch angle with the Orioles. That is a really good improvement in just a couple of months, but that was really the only thing that improved. The results did not come with it. He was still hitting the ball fairly hard, but not even as much. And he ended up 1 for his last 24 in September at the plate for the O's. He wasn't even really playing as much against lefties, especially once they got Westberg and Arias back, and it just seemed like the writing was on the wall. He's still so injured. He just can't play the field at all, so he's only a DH/pinch hitter. And the O's with Mountcastle back as well just have better right-handed options. Again, he's still an option for the postseason roster, but it seems unlikely the O's will decline his player option in the offseason. He'll become a free agent. Maybe they would consider a reunion with Jimenez for a cheap deal, but that may have been the last we see of Eloy Jimenez. I still like the trade. I still think it was worth the risk. They barely gave up anything. Just didn't work out in the long term. Had a couple of big hits early there, just didn't fully work out. But he was more of an injury replacement potentially than anything. So it's nice that the O's are now fully healthy, and that is why they have sent Jimenez back down. And now they have this full lineup back. I mean, James McCann will probably give Adley at least one more day off before the season's over, and Slater will probably start over O'Hearn versus a lefty. I mean, maybe you see Kjerstad jump in there, but otherwise, this is a fully healthy lineup again, which is really, really good to see. And, Kjerstad and Holiday are going to want to play too and get Mountcastle in there, but you have these options. You aren't scraping for the bottom of the barrel to start Livan Soto and Emmanuel Rivera and Austin Slater every day, or guys like Nick Maton or whatever it may be. You can put out a really good lineup where Heston Kjerstad and Jackson Holiday are both on the bench. That is a much, much, much better spot for the O's to be in offensively right now. That is why it's so, so great to get Mountcastle back. And the one other piece of O's news from Tuesday is that Craig Kimbrell was officially released. We know he was DFA'd last week. He cleared waivers. He became a free agent. I didn't think anybody was going to try to pick him up for the final week of the season. It'll be interesting to see if he gets a major league deal from anyone in the offseason, but was definitely a kind of a sad ending for him. But the Orioles have moved on to the next step, and that next step is clinching a postseason berth. So that is all well and good. But the next question is, what's next for the O's? Because they're not going to completely lay down. They are still making sure that they can lock up the top wildcard spot, which guarantees that wildcard series at home next week. So to finish off the pod coming up next, just give you an update on what it looks like to get that number one wild card and lock that down before this regular season ends. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Game Time. Game Time, an amazing place to get tickets. But now they have a new feature, and it's called Game Time Picks. And it makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. The Game Time Picks, it's a curation process. Makes it easier to save more on those Orioles tickets. And while there's no more regular season games at Camden Yards, we're inching closer and closer to a playoff series next Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. You might find some good deals if you head over to Game Time. They've got the lowest price guarantee. And if not, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Pretty good deal to me. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB. That is LOCKEDON MLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. So technically, the Orioles are still alive for the AL East. They would have to win their final 5 games, and the Yankees lose their final 5 games for that to happen. But more so, what the Orioles' attention is now turned to is that top wild card spot, remaining as wild card number 1, which means you are the 4 seed and you host the 5 seed for all either 2 or 3 games of the best of 3 wild card series that would be played next Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And they are very close now to clinching that. Essentially, their magic number is 2 to clinch that, and they're fighting off only the Tigers and the Royals. Because the O's clinched a playoff spot with the Twins losing to the Marlins 4-1 on Tuesday, that means Minnesota cannot catch the O's. So only Detroit and Kansas City, who both won on Tuesday. Royals beat the Nats 1-0 in 10 innings. Tigers beat the Rays 2-1 on Tuesday afternoon. So both of those teams are still 4 games back of the Orioles for that number 1 wildcard spot, with 5 games remaining. Now, if it's just Kansas City tied with the O's, the Orioles have the tiebreaker there. As I mentioned, they went 4-2 against the Royals this year. So the Orioles' magic number is just 1 to make sure the Royals can't catch them. For the Detroit Tigers, however, they went 4-2 against the O's. So if they end up tied with Baltimore, Detroit will get that number 1 wild card seed. And as I talked about on yesterday's episode, if somehow all 3 of these teams, the O's, the Tigers, and the Royals, finish tied in the wild card, which would basically mean they're all getting into the playoffs, but there's a tiebreaker to find out who is getting into the postseason, or excuse me, who would get the number 1 wild card. It would be ranked out Tigers, Orioles, Royals is how it would go. So if there's a 3-way tie, the O's also would not play at home. So they basically need to look at 2 combined Orioles wins and Tigers losses for the rest of the year, combined with at least 1 Royals loss potentially as well, to make sure they can lock up that number 1 wild card. And they could do that tonight. Game 2 against the Yankees. Zach Eflin, who's been fantastic, no starting pitcher dealt at the deadline, has a better ERA since the trade deadline than Zach Eflin. And his ERA is almost a run lower than Yusei Kikuchi's, who's been the next best ERA-wise pitcher traded at the deadline. The O's got a steal in the Eflin deal. He will go up against the lefty Nestor Cortez. So expect Ryan Mountcastle in that lineup, maybe Austin Slater. Maybe we could see Emmanuel Rivera. Probably not at this point, though, with as healthy as the Orioles have gotten. And if the O's can win, Plus, get a Tigers loss to the Tampa Bay Rays. The Orioles would clinch the number one wild card spot here on Wednesday. And that would be nice because that means still with 4 games remaining in the regular season, you don't have a lot to play for. So you can set up your pitching, you can rest guys, you can get everybody healthy, you can do whatever you feel is right to get ready for the playoffs. So again, O's win, and we're cheering for those Tampa Bay Rays to take down the Tigers, and the O's would clinch the number one wild card. And I will be back with you tomorrow, hopefully talking about the O's locking up that top wild card spot. And maybe, if that's the case, they would technically still be in play for the AL East with 4 games remaining. Plus, we'll continue to look ahead at what the playoffs will bring. Maybe another edition of the Bullpen Trust Power Rankings coming up on tomorrow's pod as well. But again, that is coming your way on Thursday. Until then, I am Connor Newcomb. The Baltimore Orioles are going to the postseason. You can flip the script now. Time to forget all that bad stuff that happened in the last couple of months. The O's are in the playoffs. Anything can happen, and we know they're in. I'm back to talk about it more tomorrow. But until then, this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.